How do you break a dependency that, for 50 years, was designed to make war less likely? Europe has spent 4 years trying to answer that question. Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022. Europe imposed sanctions, rewired its energy system, filled new LNG terminals, built new pipelines, and watched the Nord Stream network, the physical symbol of the old relationship, lie damaged on the seabed. And yet the relationship did not disappear overnight. In 2025, the European Union still imported about 36 billion cubic meters of Russian gas. And in the first months of 2026, Russian gas imports actually rose before the phase-out rules tightened further. That sounds absurd until you look at how the dependency was built. Because this is not really a story about a country waking up one morning and deciding to buy Russian gas. It is a story about pipes, contracts, factories, politicians, prices, and a theory of international relations that worked well enough for long enough to become part of the infrastructure itself. Let me start with a detail that I think gets lost when this history is told as a morality play. The original bargain did not look crazy. In the late 1960s, West Germany was trying something new. Willy Brandt became chancellor in 1969, and his Ostpolitik was built around engagement with Eastern Europe rather than permanent confrontation. One of its broader assumptions was captured in the phrase Wandel durch Handel, change through trade. The idea was not simply, buy Soviet gas and everything will be fine. It was more ambitious. If economic relationships crossed the Iron Curtain, perhaps they could create habits of cooperation, give both sides something to lose, and make political conflict less dangerous. Energy was unusually good for that purpose. Europe needed energy. The Soviet Union had enormous gas reserves, and the infrastructure required to connect them could create a relationship that lasted for decades rather than election cycles. In 1970, West German and Soviet interests moved into a landmark gas and pipes arrangement. German industry supplied large-diameter steel pipe and related financing. In return, Soviet gas flowed west under long-term commercial agreements. The details matter because this was not simply one government handing another government a blank check. It was a network of firms, banks, utilities, and state policy that made the trade possible. And that is the first thing I want you to notice. Dependency does not usually begin with dependency. It begins with a deal that makes sense. From Washington, the strategic objection was obvious. If Western Europe became dependent on Soviet energy, the Soviet Union would gain leverage over countries that were supposed to be the United States' allies in the Cold War. American officials raised versions of that concern during the 1970s. But the Europeans had their own calculation. Soviet gas was useful, relatively predictable, and could be delivered through infrastructure that was expensive to build but cheap to operate once it existed. Then, in December 1981, Poland imposed martial law and crushed the Solidarity movement. Ronald Reagan's administration decided that the pipeline relationship had become part of a much larger problem. The sanctions became a serious transatlantic dispute in 1982. Washington restricted U.S. equipment and technology, then extended the measures to European subsidiaries and companies operating under U.S. licenses. The intention was not subtle: make it difficult or impossible for the Siberian gas pipeline project to proceed. Europe pushed back. France, West Germany, Britain, and others objected, because Washington was attempting to control commercial commitments that European companies had already made. The dispute became a fight over something bigger than one pipeline: how far the United States could use its economic power to dictate the energy choices of its allies. And this is where I would resist the neat version of the story. It is tempting to say, Reagan tried to stop Russian gas, Europe defeated him, end of story. The historical record is messier. Washington and its allies negotiated, argued about the scope and legal basis of the sanctions, and tried to find a multilateral arrangement. By the end of 1982, the United States backed away from the most controversial measures. But the political lesson in Europe was important. Pressure from Washington had not destroyed the underlying energy relationship. The project continued. The pipeline was completed in the 1980s. That did something psychologically powerful. It made continued energy trade with the Soviet Union look survivable. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. You might expect that to end the story. In a strange way, it did the opposite. The Cold War disappeared, but the infrastructure stayed exactly where it was. The pipelines did not care which flag was flying over Moscow. The steel in the ground had a much longer life than the ideology that had justified building it. And now, the logic became even more commercial. Germany had major industrial demand. Russia had gas. European utilities had customers. Long-term contracts could provide predictability. Pipelines could deliver enormous volumes without needing ships, liquefaction plants, or regasification terminals on the receiving end. This is why I think the usual question, why didn't Europe diversify earlier, needs a better answer. Because diversification costs money before it produces security. Existing infrastructure produces value every day. That is the trap. When a system works, every investment made yesterday becomes an argument for continuing the system tomorrow. The most consequential version of this logic came with Nord Stream. In 2005, Germany and Russia finalized plans for an undersea gas pipeline running directly from Russia to Germany under the Baltic Sea. Gerhard Schroeder, then at the end of his chancellorship, was involved in the political signing. Shortly after leaving office, he took a leadership role connected to the Nord Stream project, and later became chairman of Rosneft. Those appointments were public and controversial in Germany. They are also useful for understanding another layer of dependency. Infrastructure does not create only physical connections. It creates institutions, commercial interests, and people whose professional lives become connected to those systems. Nord Stream 1 began operating in 2011. Nord Stream 2 was pushed forward after that. What makes the timing uncomfortable is that planning for Nord Stream 2 accelerated after Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014. So the question was no longer whether Germany knew Russia could use force against its neighbors. The answer was already on the front page of European newspapers. The question was whether that political warning outweighed the economic logic of the existing energy system. For years, the answer was no. That does not mean every German policymaker believed Russia was harmless. It means something more interesting. Many policymakers believed the economic relationship itself could reduce the risk of a larger confrontation, or at least make that confrontation so costly that neither side would choose it. In other words, the old theory had changed form. The pipes were no longer just a commercial tool. They had become part of a theory about stability. February 2022 broke the argument open. Germany suspended certification of Nord Stream 2 on the 22nd of February. Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine on the 24th February. By the end of August, Nord Stream 1 was no longer delivering gas to Germany. At that point, Europe was no longer debating whether economic interdependence might prevent geopolitical conflict. The conflict was here. And then, on the 26th September 2022, the physical symbol of the old relationship was attacked. Explosions damaged 3 of the 4 strings of Nord Stream 1 and 2, the Trine, the Baltic Sea near Bornholm. The Danish investigation later concluded that the pipelines had been deliberately sabotaged. Sweden ended its own investigation in February 2024 because it determined that Swedish jurisdiction did not apply, while stating that its material had been shared with Germany. That distinction matters. I would not tell you that Denmark and Sweden jointly identified the perpetrator, because they did not publicly do that. I would tell you what we actually know. The damage was deliberate. Denmark closed its criminal investigation without sufficient basis to pursue a case. Sweden closed its investigation on jurisdictional grounds, and Germany continued investigating. And as I write this in August 2026, Germany's case has moved much further. In July 2026, federal prosecutors charged a former Ukrainian officer, identified under German privacy rules as Serhiy K., alleging that he helped coordinate the operation on behalf of Ukrainian state entities. On the 19th of August 2026, German authorities announced the arrest in Croatia of another Ukrainian suspect, Vladimir Z., whom they allege participated in the diving operation. Those are allegations, not a final judicial finding. The case is still moving through the courts. Ukraine has said it does not have enough information to respond to the specifics of the German allegations. Russia continues to accuse Western intelligence services without producing evidence that has been accepted by the relevant investigations. For this video, the important point is not to solve a criminal case that is still legally unresolved. The important point is what happened to the theory that built the infrastructure in the first place. The infrastructure that was supposed to make war too costly to imagine had become something both sides could live with losing. Here is the part of the story that I think is easiest to misunderstand. Once Nord Stream was damaged, it would be tempting to say the dependency was physically destroyed. But Europe's gas market was never the same thing as Nord Stream. The network was larger. Some pipelines were still intact. Gas could enter the European market through different routes. And Russia could also sell LNG by ship, which meant that a country did not necessarily need a direct pipeline from Russia to receive Russian gas. That distinction matters because infrastructure dependency is not always about one pipe. It can be about an entire market architecture. In 2021, before the full-scale invasion, the EU imported roughly 150 billion cubic meters of Russian gas when pipeline gas and LNG are combined. By 2025, that had fallen to about 36 billion cubic meters. That is a huge reduction. But 36 billion cubic meters is still a very large number when your stated policy is to get to zero. And there is a subtle point here. Russian gas entering the EU is not necessarily gas burned in the country where it lands. The European gas market is interconnected. Molecules are traded, moved across borders, and mixed inside the network. That makes the final destination of any individual Russian molecule difficult to trace. So when you ask, who is still dependent? The answer is not as simple as drawing a line from a Russian pipe to a German furnace. The dependence has become a market problem as much as a bilateral relationship. Then there are contracts. A pipeline is expensive. An LNG project is expensive. Storage is expensive. Energy companies therefore make long-term commitments because they want predictable supply, predictable revenue, and predictable financing. The problem is that a contract signed in one political era can remain economically relevant in another. That is exactly what the European Union has been trying to unwind. On the 26th of January 2026, all 27 EU member states formally adopted the regulation for a phased ban on Russian pipeline gas and LNG. But the law was deliberately designed as a transition, because governments need time to replace contracts and, more importantly, make sure replacement supply actually existed. For LNG under qualifying long-term contracts, the effective prohibition comes on the 1 January 2027. For qualifying long-term pipeline contracts, the principal deadline is 30th September 2027, with a possible extension to the 1st November 2027 in a specific supply security scenario. That is not a loophole in the sense of the EU secretly wanting Russian gas forever. It is the uncomfortable reality of how energy systems work. You cannot announce a new supplier into existence with a press release, and this is where the story gets almost embarrassingly human. In the first 5 months of 2026, Russian pipeline gas imports into the EU were up about 7% year-on-year, while Russian LNG imports were up about 11%, according to the EU Agency for the Cooperation of Energy Regulators, ACR. Why would imports rise while the law is trying to eliminate them? Partly because companies were still operating inside the transition period. Partly because existing contracts remained valid. Partly because deliveries were being brought forward before tighter restrictions applied. That behavior makes perfect sense from inside a company. If a contract still allows you to buy a commodity and you know the window is closing, buying now rather than later can be rational. From the perspective of a government trying to change the system, it looks absurd. That tension is the whole story in miniature. Political change moves at the speed of decisions. Energy systems move at the speed of contracts, ships, terminals, storage tanks, and replacement capacity. At this point, I think we can answer the original question directly. Europe could not simply quit Russian gas in 2022 because 4 different kinds of lock-in were operating at the same time. Lock 1. Physical infrastructure, pipelines, LNG terminals, storage facilities, and interconnections are built for decades. You do not replace them like you replace a supplier on a spreadsheet. Lock 2. Contracts and finance long-term contracts exist because somebody financed infrastructure on the expectation that gas would move through it. Breaking the commercial chain has legal and financial consequences. Lock 3. Market structure. Europe has one of the world's most interconnected gas markets. Gas purchased in one country can move somewhere else. That makes Russian gas dependence a network problem rather than a simple national tally. Lock 4. The original political logic. And finally, there was an idea behind the system. Interdependence could stabilize relations. For much of the period from the 1970s into the early 2000s, that idea did not look ridiculous. It survived the Cold War. It survived the Soviet collapse. It survived repeated political arguments about Russia. The problem was not that trade had never created stability. The problem was that nobody could guarantee that economic interdependence would remain stronger than a state's willingness to pursue its strategic goals. This is where I think the history gets genuinely interesting. It is easy from 2026 to look back at 1970 and say, obviously this was a mistake. I am not convinced that is the fairest reading. Imagine sitting in West Germany in 1970. You are looking at a divided Europe, a Soviet Union with enormous energy reserves, an industrial economy that needs reliable fuel, and a Cold War in which direct military confrontation is precisely what everyone wants to avoid. A policy that creates commercial interdependence can look like a way of buying stability. The deeper mistake was not necessarily starting the trade. It was allowing the trade to become difficult to reverse without building enough resilience for the day the political assumptions stopped holding. That is a very different lesson. And honestly, I think it is a more useful one. Because the danger was never simply, Russia sells gas. The danger was building a system in which too many institutions learned to assume that the relationship would continue. There is another side that often disappears from this story. Interdependence did not mean that only Europe was vulnerable. Russia also built a business model around European demand. Pipelines were constructed west because the customer was west. Production was organized around long-term sales. Companies and government revenues adapted to that market. That meant the relationship was not simply a one-way lever in Moscow's hands. It was a system of mutual dependence, until the political value of breaking it became greater than the economic value of preserving it. That is why the 2022 rupture was so consequential. Europe discovered that it could replace Russian gas faster than many had expected, but at enormous cost and through a scramble for alternative supplies. Russia, meanwhile, discovered that access to Europe was not something it could simply assume would exist forever. The old relationship did not collapse because somebody suddenly found a magic substitute. It collapsed because the value of the relationship changed. So what does 2027 actually represent? Not a finish line where Europe suddenly becomes independent on the 1 of October. It is the legal endpoint of a much longer transition that began before the ban was written. New LNG capacity, new suppliers, more storage, new interconnections, demand reduction, renewables, efficiency measures, and the political willingness to accept higher costs in exchange for lower strategic exposure. And there is a final irony here. The same infrastructure that once made dependence easy is now part of the reason unwinding it is expensive. But some of that infrastructure can also make diversification easier once the alternatives are connected. Infrastructure is not destiny. It is inertia. So, did the idea behind all of this fail? I would phrase it more carefully. The idea that trade can create stability did not become nonsense. Economic interdependence can reduce conflict in some circumstances. What failed was the stronger assumption that economic interdependence would remain powerful enough to restrain a state that had decided its strategic objectives were worth the economic cost. For 50 years, Europe built a relationship on the expectation that the pipes would keep running because everyone had reasons to keep them running. Then those reasons changed. And that is why the story did not end when Nord Stream was sabotaged. It did not end when Russia cut off Nord Stream 1. It did not end when Europe announced that it would quit Russian gas. Because the physical network is only one layer of dependency. Underneath the pipes are contracts. Under the contracts are investments. Under the investments are industries. Under the industries are jobs and political constituencies. And underneath all of that is a belief about how international politics is supposed to work. That is the part that takes the longest to dismantle. As of 2026, Europe is much less dependent on Russian gas than it was before the invasion. The numbers prove that. But it has not yet reached zero, and the remaining dependence is being unwound on the schedule of infrastructure and contracts, not the schedule of headlines. Maybe that is the real lesson here. The hardest dependencies are rarely the ones people cannot see. They are the ones that once made perfect sense. And when you build a system to last 50 years, it will not disappear just because you finally change your mind about it. For Europe, the question is no longer whether the old relationship was a mistake. The question is whether it can finish dismantling it before the next crisis makes the decision for it.